Hey folks, today we're going to be looking at comparing and contrasting the government structures and goals of the Spanish, French, and English forming colonies in North America. Before we move on, let's start with a quick review, defining push and pull factors and an example of each. Push factors were factors that would force someone to move out of their native land. Some examples of push factors are war, famine, starvation, um, high crime. These are many things that we mentioned last class that would force one to leave their native land or just their community. Some pull factors or a pull factor is something that attracts someone to move to a new area. For example, affordable wages, better job opportunities, a safer environment, a better climate. All those things would attract someone to move to a new area. So let's move on to looking at these three different colonies, European colonies throughout North America. We'll start with the Spanish colonies. But first, before we even get into that, let's look at this map. So when we look at these maps, we should be looking at the title. It states North America in the year 1700. Then we should be looking at the key, where it tells us the territory that is highlighted in red, where lands occupied by the British, the lands highlighted in green, were lands occupied by the French, and the lands highlighted by in orange were lands occupied by the Spanish. And you can see that the Spanish and the French definitely had a lot more territory that they occupied. But later on, we'll talk about how the British expanded these colonies and pretty much took over what is now the United States. But first, let's look at the Spanish. So, where were these Spanish colonies located? All along the coast of California, as you can see here. You can see in St. Augustine, Florida, which is one of the oldest settlements in North America. This was founded in 1565. Santa Fe, New Mexico, founded in 1610, and they had other cities in present-day Texas and California. And then you can see in the map, they go all the way through Mexico, Central America, and all the way through South America as well. What was the government structure like? The king was in charge. The king was the sole ruler. However, he was 3,000 miles away and could not really implement a lot of his rule by himself. So what he did was appointed viceroys and governors to be his eyes and ears in the colonies in North America, and they were the ones who kind of spoke for the king and made sure and kept order in those colonies. All right. How do they make money? The Spanish colonies were a trading economy. They traded goods that they accumulated in North America. A lot of the goods that they would have traded with Native Americans, and they would bring it back to Europe and trade them for a profit. There was some farming as well, but the trading was their biggest moneymaker. How was their relationship with Native Americans? Not very good. Native Americans and the Spanish had a pretty brutal relationship where the Spanish definitely looked at the natives as heathens, and many Spanish missionaries, Catholic missionaries, wanted to convert them to Christianity because they felt that they did not have any kind of faith in God. So their goal was to convert them to become Catholics, sometimes by force. The soldiers, the conquistadors, was their name, they viewed them as fit only for killing or subjugation to dominate. So that's a recipe for disaster. And there was a lot of murder and war in these colonies, and it was not a good sight. So the goals of the Spanish colonies were God, glory, and gold. God pretty much means they wanted to convert these non-Christians into Christians. Glory is they wanted to establish the largest empire in the world, gain new land, because they wanted to have, because more land equals more power for the Spanish. And then finally, gold, which is money. They wanted to find a sea route to Asia so they can gain wealth from the silk and spice trade there. They felt that if they could find a quicker route from Europe to Asia, they would have a leg up on the other European nations. However, there wasn't a quicker route than the one that they were all using before. So, real quick, kind of think back to what we just talked about with the Spanish colonies. I want you to identify one positive impact and one negative impact of Spanish colonization of the New World. And when we're looking at positives, it's definitely not going to be a positive for everyone. It'll probably be more of a positive for the Spanish, specifically the King of Spain. But we can definitely identify a lot of negatives. So now let's look at the French colonies. If you look at this map, you can see This is 45 years later from the original map we saw, and we could see that it looks like the French gained more territory. In blue is all the French territory in the New World. Here we have the English in red, and the yellow is the Spanish territory. So let's look at some of the French colonies. A lot of their locations were located in Newfoundland, St. Lawrence Valley, parts of Canada, as well as Mississippi River. And we'll talk a lot about the Mississippi River this year. Their government structure was the colonies were fully subject to the French king. The French king was the ultimate ruler. The French colonies did not have any political rights or representation in the New World. They pretty much had to just abide by the king, and they didn't have to say so in how they would be ruled. Now, quickly, I want you to look at this image. I want you to kind of think about what we talked about with the Spanish and the Native Americans. I want you to compare or contrast this image. How do you think the French, who are wearing the coats and the hats, how do you think their relationship was like with the Native Americans, just based on this image? And we'll talk about that in a second. So, how did the French colonists make money? They were dependent on the fur trade. A lot of the furs that they would trap were beaver pelts. They would trap those fur, and then they would ship it to Europe. And in Europe is where they would trade a lot of these beaver pelts and make a good amount of money. It was a very popular item in Europe at the time. Their relationship with the Native Americans was they had a strong alliance with the Native Americans. They would trade with the Native Americans. The Native Americans would teach them teach them about the land because they were there prior to the French arriving. So they would learn a lot about the land. And the relationship was so good that some French settlers actually would marry some Native American women. The goals for the French colonies were to find a river route through North America to Asia, but that led to the French exploring a lot of the continent. And that's why when you saw the original map, you saw that blue territory went all the way from as north in Canada as possible, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, because they were trying to find that river route that cut through North America from the east all the way to the west. Spoiler alert, that doesn't exist. There is no river route that cuts through America. But they didn't know that because they don't have modern technology like we have now. So they had to go out and physically explore that land. They also wanted to create fur trading posts, which were very successful in, as we indicated, in how they made money. Also, they wanted to convert American Indians into Catholicism, similar to what the Spanish did. They might have done so not as harshly as the Spanish did, though. So, what do you think again? Can you identify one positive and one negative impact of the French colonization of the New World? Now let's look at the British colonies. We are going to spend most of our time in this unit looking at these British colonies. Here you can see the original 13 colonies. We will talk a lot about those in depth soon. So the location, they're all located along the Atlantic coast, as far north as Maine to as far south as Georgia. And the British claimed the land from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Mississippi River. However, if you notice in the map before, the French claimed a lot of that land too. So that did lead to some conflict between the different European colonies in North America, because they would a lot of times have disputed claims where they said, I claim this, and the other country said, no, I claim this. And sometimes it would lead to a peaceful settlement, and sometimes it would lead to fiscal conflict, which we'll talk about more this year. The government structure is very unique compared to the other two countries' colonies that we talked about. Each individual colonies had their own local governments where they ruled and made laws for each colony. So, for example, North Carolina might have had a different set of laws than New Hampshire because they had their own local representation. However, the king had ultimate rule. However, he gave these colonies a little of freedom for a little while, and we'll talk a lot about that later on. And how did these British colonies make money? Farming, fishing, and trading. As you can see, they're located all along the Atlantic coast, so that makes it perfect for fishing because they're right by the Atlantic Ocean. Also, some of the farming some of the products that they did farm were tobacco, rice, timber, and fish. Or they didn't farm timber or fish, but tobacco, which was one of the original main crops in Virginia and Jamestown. We'll talk a lot about that next class. The relationship that the British colonists had with Native Americans started off friendly at first, and as the British colonies began to expand, that led to more conflicts with Native Americans. And we will talk a lot about different conflicts with Native Americans this unit as well. The British colonies' goals were to add land to extend its empire, just like the Spanish were also doing. Also, mercantilism, which is a country wanted to export more goods than they imported. So they wanted to sell more goods, and obviously the way they sell more goods is have more land and more resources to be able to sell. So that's why they were colonizing different lands throughout the world. Also, it was they had this idea. It was a fresh start for many poor citizens in England. Many cities in England were overcrowded, and people were in debt. And when people were in debt at the time in England, they got thrown into debtor's prison. So these debtor's prisons were becoming overcrowded. So they had an idea, hey, we could send these colonists who are in debt, they could send them to the New World, they can farm, they can pay us back by working for us. And then in exchange, we can give them a small piece of land and then they can kind of create their own new life. And also, many people in England at the time were were being persecuted for their religious beliefs. If you were not a member of the Church of England, which is also known as the Anglican Church, they were being persecuted and forced pretty much to leave. So just like we said before, can you identify one positive impact and one negative impact of British colonization in the New World? And then finally, I want you to think, compare and contrast um, at least find one similarity between all of the three countries' colonies, Spanish, French, and British, and try to find one difference between the Spanish, French, and British. It might be hard to find one overarching similarity and one overarching contrast, but I think you might be able to. So let's give it a whirl. And finally, I want to talk to you about your assignment that is due Sunday. I have noticed that many of you are knocking these out of the ballpark, and I'm super proud. Just to make sure, you should find it on Schoology in the folder that is titled August 17th to August 23rd, 1.01 and 1.02. It has all these folders in there. If you are having any difficulty accessing any of that information, please let me know. Please reach out via phone. You can check your updates in Schoology. I posted my phone number, my email. You could send me a direct message on Instagram. You can set up a bookings appointment where I could work with you one-on-one on an assignment. Don't wait to the last minute. I'm telling you now, it could bite you in the butt in the long run. So make sure you're not waiting until Saturday night to do it. It is a lot of work. And in order to do it well, you should give yourself some time to do it. So the first one is you're just reading a short little text on the introduction to early settlement. Then there's a pre-assessment. The pre-assessment is going to be extremely difficult. That's fine. I want you to take it and try your best. It's a 25 questions, all multiple choice, but all the information is stuff that we will be learning about. So if you don't know it, that's fine now. But by the end of you studying some of this information and listening to me in our um, uh, synchronous classes, you will be fine. Next is reading 1.02 America's Geography. There's a graphic organizer that goes along with the reading, so you should probably open that up in a separate tab and jot down the notes. And then once you're done jotting it down, please make sure you click that submit button so I can see that you have completed that. Because if you don't click submit, it doesn't get sent to me and therefore I can't grade it. And then finally, there's a 5-question assessment on what you read. So these two assignments, the graphic organizer as well as America's Geography, will actually be counted as a full grade in the grade book, whereas the pre-assessment won't be, but the pre-assessment is mandatory to move on. So make sure you get all 3 of those things done, and then you are A-OK for this week. If you have any questions, you know how to reach me. I hope you all have a great one. Peace out, y'all.